Australia is often described as one of the most unique ecosystems on Earth, with more than 80% of its mammals, reptiles, and amphibians found nowhere else. Yet this ecological uniqueness also makes it extremely fragile. Over the past 2 centuries, the continent has faced an escalating crisis. Invasive species have contributed to the extinction of at least 34 mammal species, more than any other country in the world. In response to this growing threat, an unusual and controversial idea emerged, using cats, a familiar domestic animal, as a biological tool to control other invasive species. At first glance, the logic seems straightforward. Cats are highly efficient predators, capable of hunting rodents and small animals with remarkable success. In many parts of the world, they have historically been used to control pests, such as rats on farms or ships, compared to chemical methods like poisons which can contaminate soil and water. Introducing a natural predator appeared to be a more environmentally friendly solution. In theory, this approach aligned with ecological principles, restoring balance by reintroducing predation into disrupted systems. However, Australia's situation was far more complex. Unlike regions where ecosystems co-evolved with feline predators, most native Australian species developed in isolation for millions of years without exposure to such hunters. As a result, many small mammals and ground-nesting birds lack defensive behaviors against stealth predators like cats. This fundamental mismatch raises a critical question. Can a solution that works in one ecological context be safely applied to another? The idea of unleashing cats therefore sits at the intersection of necessity and risk. On one hand, invasive species were causing widespread environmental damage, threatening biodiversity and agricultural stability. On the other hand, introducing or enabling another predator, especially one already known for its adaptability, risked compounding the problem rather than solving it. This tension highlights a broader issue in environmental management. When humans attempt to fix ecological imbalances, how often do short-term solutions create long-term consequences? By examining this case, we are not just exploring a single policy decision in Australia, but also confronting a global challenge: how to intervene in nature responsibly when the stakes include entire ecosystems. Australia's invasive species crisis is widely regarded as one of the most severe in the world, both in scale and ecological impact. Since European settlement began in 1788, more than 100 non-native species have been introduced, either intentionally or accidentally. Among these, a few have caused disproportionate damage, particularly the European rabbit, red fox, and various rodent species. Today, invasive animals are estimated to affect over 70% of Australia's threatened species, making them a leading driver of biodiversity loss across the continent. One of the most destructive examples is the European rabbit. Introduced in the 19th century for hunting, their population exploded to an estimated 600 million by the early 20th century. Their overgrazing stripped vast areas of vegetation, leading to soil erosion and the degradation of entire ecosystems. In comparison, native herbivores such as kangaroos evolved with natural population controls and do not exert the same level of pressure on the land. This contrast highlights how invasive species often lack the ecological checks and balances present in native systems. Similarly, the red fox, introduced in the 1850s, has had devastating effects on small to medium-sized native animals. Studies suggest that foxes kill hundreds of millions of native animals each year, contributing significantly to the decline of species such as bandicoots and bilbies. Rodents, particularly black rats, have also spread widely, preying on bird eggs and competing with native species for food. Unlike native predators, these invasive species often reproduce quickly and adapt easily to new environments, allowing their populations to grow unchecked. The impact extends beyond individual species to entire ecological networks. When invasive herbivores destroy vegetation, they reduce habitat availability for insects, birds, and small mammals. In turn, this affects predators higher up the food chain, creating what etologists call a trophic cascade. For example, the loss of ground cover due to rabbits not only exposes small animals to predators, but also reduces soil moisture, further altering plant communities. Compared to more balanced ecosystems where species interactions have evolved over thousands of years, Australia's disrupted systems are far more vulnerable to rapid collapse. Importantly, Australia's native wildlife is particularly susceptible because of its evolutionary isolation. Many species evolved without exposure to placental predators like foxes and cats, relying instead on camouflage or slow movement rather than active defense. This makes them easy targets for fast, efficient hunters. In contrast, ecosystems in Europe or Asia have long histories of predator-prey interactions, resulting in more resilient behavioral adaptations among prey species. Taken together, these factors illustrate why the invasive species crisis in Australia is not just a matter of numbers, but of ecological imbalance. The combination of rapid population growth, lack of natural predators, and vulnerable native species has created a situation where traditional control methods often struggle to keep pace. It is within this context of urgency and complexity that more radical solutions, such as introducing additional predators, began to be considered. The decision to use cats as a means of controlling invasive species in Australia did not emerge randomly. It was rooted in both practical reasoning and historical precedent. Cats, Felis catus, had already been present in Australia since the late 18th century, introduced by European settlers around 1788. By the 19th century, they were commonly used on farms, in settlements, and aboard ships to control rodent populations. This existing familiarity played a key role in shaping the perception that cats could be a useful biological control agent rather than a potential threat. From a functional perspective, cats possess several traits that make them highly effective predators. A single feral cat is estimated to kill between 5 and 30 animals per day, depending on food availability and habitat conditions. On a yearly scale, this can amount to over 1,1900 prey items per cat. Compared to mechanical traps or chemical poisons, which require constant human management and can lose effectiveness over time, cats offered what seemed like a self-sustaining solution. Their ability to hunt a wide range of species, rodents, rabbits, and small birds, made them appear versatile in addressing multiple invasive threats simultaneously. Another factor influencing the decision was reproductive efficiency. Cats can breed up to 2 or 3 times per year, with litters averaging 3 to 5 kittens. Under favorable conditions, a small population can expand rapidly within just a few years. In contrast, native predators such as quolls reproduce more slowly and have more specialized diets, limiting their ability to respond quickly to surging invasive populations. This difference reinforced the idea that cats could provide a faster and more scalable response to ecological imbalance. However, this reasoning also contained a critical assumption that cats would primarily target invasive species. This assumption was influenced by experiences in other parts of the world. For example, in agricultural regions of Europe and North America, cats have long been used to control mice and rats with relatively limited ecological disruption. Yet these comparisons overlooked a fundamental difference. Those ecosystems evolved alongside feline predators, whereas Australia's did not. Applying the same logic across such distinct ecological contexts introduced significant uncertainty. The historical context further complicates the picture. Cats were not newly unleashed in a controlled scientific program. Rather, their spread into the wild was often gradual and poorly regulated. By the early 20th century, feral cat populations had already established themselves across most of the continent. Estimates today suggest there are between 2 and 6 million feral cats in Australia, occupying over 99% of the landmass. This means that what may have initially been seen as a controlled solution quickly became an uncontrolled variable. In hindsight, the decision to rely on cats reflects a broader pattern in environmental management, prioritizing immediate effectiveness over long-term ecological compatibility. While the choice was supported by logical arguments, efficiency, adaptability, and historical use, it underestimated the complexity of Australia's ecosystems. Compared to targeted interventions such as fencing or species-specific biological controls, introducing a generalist predator like the cat carried far greater systemic risk. This trade-off between short-term gain and long-term stability lies at the heart of the decision and its consequences. In practice, the use of cats as a biological control method in Australia was not implemented through a single centralized policy, but rather through a combination of intentional introduction and unregulated spread. Beginning in the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, Domestic cats were brought by European settlers and released or allowed to roam freely in rural and semi-wild environments. Their initial role was localized, protecting food stores and agricultural areas from rodents, but over time, many of these animals either escaped or were abandoned, forming self-sustaining feral populations. Unlike modern wildlife management programs, there was little to no systematic planning or ecological assessment guiding this process. There were no population caps, no controlled breeding measures, and no long-term monitoring systems in place. As a result, cat populations expanded rapidly and unpredictably. By the early 1900s, feral cats had already spread across vast regions, including arid deserts, forests, and coastal zones. Today, they occupy approximately 99% of Australia's landmass, with densities ranging from 0.1 to over 10 cats per square kilometer depending on habitat conditions. Following events like droughts or bushfires, these densities can spike dramatically as cats concentrate in areas with remaining prey. A key limitation in the implementation phase was the assumption that natural environmental constraints would regulate cat populations. In theory, factors such as food scarcity and territorial behavior should limit overpopulation. However, Australia's ecosystems, already destabilized by invasive prey species like rabbits and rodents, provided an abundant and continuous food supply. This created a feedback loop. More prey supported more cats, and more cats increased predation pressure on both invasive and native species. Compared to tightly managed biological control programs, where a specific predator or pathogen is introduced under controlled conditions, the spread of cats in Australia lacked any such precision. Another major oversight was the absence of species-specific targeting. Cats are generalist predators, meaning they do not discriminate between invasive and native prey. Studies have shown that in many regions, native animals make up a significant portion of their diet. For example, in forested and grassland habitats, small marsupials, reptiles, and birds are often more vulnerable and easier to catch than invasive species. This contrasts sharply with more specialized control methods, such as the use of the myxoma virus for rabbits in the 1950s, which specifically targeted one species and initially reduced rabbit populations by up to 90%. Furthermore, there was minimal investment in monitoring and data collection during the early stages of this approach. Without baseline data or continuous tracking, it became difficult to measure effectiveness or detect unintended consequences in real time. In modern environmental management, adaptive strategies rely heavily on data-driven feedback loops, but such frameworks were largely absent during the period when cats became widespread. In comparison to contemporary conservation practices, such as fenced reserves, targeted baiting programs, and GPS wildlife tracking, the historical implementation of cat-based control appears notably unstructured. What began as a seemingly practical and low-cost solution evolved into a large-scale ecological experiment without clear boundaries or safeguards. This lack of control ultimately set the stage for outcomes that extended far beyond the original intent of managing invasive species. In the short term, the presence and rapid expansion of feral cats in Australia did produce some effects that appear to align with the original goal of controlling invasive species. In agricultural and semi-urban areas, cats were observed actively hunting rodents such as black rats and house mice, species known to damage crops and stored food. Field observations and localized studies suggested that in certain environments, cat predation contributed to noticeable reductions in rodent activity, particularly in regions where alternative control methods were limited or costly. Compared to passive tools like traps, which require constant resetting, cats functioned as continuous mobile hunters, operating across large territories that could exceed several kilometers. However, even these early successes were inconsistent and highly context-dependent. While cats did prey on invasive species, they did not do so exclusively. Research now estimates that feral cats in Australia kill approximately 1.5 to 2 billion native animals each year, including mammals, birds, and reptiles. On average, an individual feral cat kills around 740 animals annually, with native species making up a substantial proportion of this total. This reveals a critical imbalance. Although invasive species were part of their diet, they were far from the only, or even the primary, targets in many ecosystems. Another important factor is prey selection behavior. Cats tend to hunt based on availability and ease rather than ecological priority. In many Australian habitats, small native mammals, such as bilbies or bandicoots, are slower, less cautious, and more predictable than invasive rodents. As a result, cats often disproportionately target these native species. This contrasts with the initial expectation that cats would preferentially reduce invasive populations. In comparison, more targeted control strategies, such as poison baiting programs designed specifically for rodents or rabbits, can be calibrated to minimize unintended impacts on non-target species. Moreover, the reduction in certain invasive species populations did not necessarily translate into ecosystem recovery. In some cases, even when rodents were suppressed locally, the simultaneous decline of native species offset any ecological benefit. This highlights a key concept in ecology. Removing one pressure does not guarantee restoration if another equally strong pressure is introduced. For example, while cats may have reduced rodent numbers in a given area, their predation on insect-eating native mammals could indirectly lead to increases in insect populations, creating new imbalances. There is also evidence of what ecologists call mesopredator-release dynamics, although in reverse form. Typically, removing a top predator allows smaller predators to flourish. In this case, introducing or enabling a mid-sized predator like the cat intensify predation pressure across multiple trophic levels simultaneously. Compared to ecosystems with clearly defined predator hierarchies, Australia's altered systems became more chaotic and less predictable. In summary, while cats did achieve limited and localized control of certain invasive species, these gains were overshadowed by broader and more damaging impacts. The immediate effects, when examined in isolation, might suggest partial success. But when viewed within the full ecological context, including scale, selectivity, and unintended consequences, the results were deeply problematic. This underscores an important lesson. Effectiveness in the short term does not necessarily equate to success in the long term, especially in complex and sensitive ecosystems like Australia's. What initially appeared to be a practical solution gradually revealed itself as one of the most damaging ecological miscalculations in Australia's history. Rather than stabilizing ecosystems, feral cats evolved into a dominant invasive predator, amplifying the very crisis they were expected to mitigate. Today, their population is estimated at 2 to 6 million individuals, fluctuating with environmental conditions such as rainfall and prey availability. This scale alone places enormous and continuous pressure on native wildlife across nearly the entire continent. One of the most severe unintended consequences has been the acceleration of species decline and extinction. Scientific assessments indicate that feral cats have contributed to the extinction of at least 20 native mammal species in Australia, including small marsupials that had survived for thousands of years prior to European settlement. Currently, they pose a direct threat to over 120 threatened species, many of which exist only in fragmented or isolated habitats. In comparison, while invasive species like rabbits and foxes also cause damage, cats uniquely combine wide distribution, high hunting efficiency, and the ability to thrive in nearly all environments, from deserts to forests. A critical factor behind this impact is what etologists describe as a naive prey problem. Many Australian animals evolved without exposure to stealthy, ground-based predators like cats. As a result, they lack instinctive avoidance behaviors such as fleeing quickly or recognizing cats as a threat. This contrasts sharply with ecosystems in Africa or Eurasia, where prey species have co-evolved with feline predators over millions of years, developing acute senses and defensive strategies. In Australia, this evolutionary gap has made native species exceptionally vulnerable, turning cats into what some researchers call a super predator in this specific context. The ecological damage extends beyond individual species to entire systems through trophic cascades. For instance, when cats reduce populations of small mammals that play roles in seed dispersal or soil aeration, plant regeneration can decline. This, in turn, affects insects, birds, and larger herbivores that depend on those plants. In some arid regions, the loss of digging marsupials, often referred to as ecosystem engineers, has been linked to poorer soil quality and reduced water retention. Compared to the original problem of overgrazing by rabbits, these cascading effects are more complex and harder to reverse. Another unintended consequence is the creation of a self-reinforcing cycle of ecological imbalance. As native species decline, invasive prey like rodents may temporarily increase due to reduced competition or predation from native animals. This can sustain or even boost cat populations, ensuring their continued dominance. In contrast to targeted biological controls, such as the introduction of specific pathogens that decline alongside their host populations, cats do not naturally switch off once a problem is reduced. Their generalist diet allows them to persist by shifting between prey types. The scale of predation further illustrates the magnitude of the issue. Current estimates suggest that feral cats kill over 1.5 billion native animals annually, including around 600 million birds and hundreds of millions of reptiles and mammals. This level of predation is not only unsustainable, but also unevenly distributed, with particularly devastating effects on islands and isolated habitats where species have limited escape options. Compared to mainland ecosystems, these areas can experience near total collapse of native fauna within relatively short timeframes. In a broader sense, the case highlights a fundamental challenge in environmental intervention. Unintended consequences often emerge not from a single factor, but from interactions within complex systems. While the original goal was to control invasive species, the introduction and spread of cats created a new, more pervasive threat, one that operates across multiple ecological layers simultaneously. This underscores a key lesson in comparison with more controlled approaches. When interventions lack specificity and oversight, their long-term impacts can exceed the scale of the initial problem. From a scientific perspective, the case of cats in Australia is often cited as a textbook example of the risks associated with biological control gone wrong. Biological control, in principle, involves introducing a natural predator, parasite, or pathogen to reduce the population of a harmful species. When carefully designed, such methods can be highly effective. For instance, the introduction of the myxoma virus in the 1950s reduced Australia's rabbit population by up to 99% in some regions during the initial years. However, this success depended on a key factor, specificity. The virus targeted rabbits almost exclusively, minimizing unintended ecological damage. In contrast, cats represent a generalist predator, meaning they do not specialize in a single prey species. This fundamental difference is central to understanding why the approach failed. Scientific studies show that feral cats in Australia consume a highly varied diet, including over 400 different species of animals. Such non-selective predation makes it nearly impossible to predict or control their ecological impact. Compared to specialized agents used in controlled biological programs, generalists introduce a high degree of uncertainty and risk. Another critical scientific concept highlighted by this case is ecological mismatch. Australia's native fauna evolved in isolation for approximately 45 million years, with very limited exposure to placental mammalian predators. As a result, many species lack adaptive behavior such as rapid flight responses or predator recognition. In ecosystems where predators and prey co-evolve, such as in Africa, this dynamic leads to a relative balance, with survival depending on speed, camouflage, or group behavior. In Australia, however, the sudden introduction of an efficient predator like the cat disrupted this balance almost instantly, leading to disproportionately high mortality rates among native species. The situation also illustrates the principle of nonlinear ecological effects. In complex ecosystems, small changes can produce disproportionately large outcomes due to interconnected relationships. For example, the decline of small mammals caused by cat predation does not only affect those species directly. Many of these animals play roles in seed dispersal, pollination, and soil turnover. Research has shown that the loss of such ecosystem engineers can reduce soil fertility and alter vegetation patterns over time. Compared to direct impacts like predation, these indirect effects are often slower to detect but more difficult to reverse. A useful comparison can be made with other global cases of invasive species management. In New Zealand, for example, introduced predators such as stoats and cats have also devastated native bird populations. However, modern conservation strategies there emphasize strict containment, island sanctuaries, and complete eradication programs, rather than relying on additional predator introductions. Similarly, in parts of North America, biological control efforts now undergo extensive risk assessments, including multi-year trials and ecosystem modeling, before implementation. These examples highlight how scientific understanding has evolved, placing greater emphasis on precaution and system-wide analysis. Quantitative modeling further reinforces these conclusions. Ecological simulations suggest that even a small increase in predator efficiency can lead to exponential declines in vulnerable prey populations. In Australia, where cats kill an estimated 1.5 to 2 billion native animals annually, the scale of impact far exceeds what most ecosystems can sustain. By comparison, stable ecosystems typically maintain predator-prey ratios that fluctuate within narrow limits, preventing collapse. Ultimately, the scientific analysis of this case underscores a key lesson. Effectiveness must be evaluated within the full complexity of an ecosystem, not just in terms of immediate results. While cats were undeniably effective hunters, their lack of selectivity, combined with Australia's unique ecological history, made them an unsuitable tool for targeted control. Compared to modern, data-driven conservation approaches, this case reflects an earlier era of environmental management, one that often underestimated as the ecological impact of feral cats became increasingly evident. The Australian government and conservation organizations began shifting from passive tolerance to active management. By the early 21st century, feral cats were officially recognized as a major threat to biodiversity, prompting the development of coordinated national strategies. One of the most significant initiatives is Australia's Threatened Species Strategy, which set targets to reduce feral cat populations and protect vulnerable native wildlife. At one point, the government announced plans to cull up to 2 million feral cats by 2020, reflecting both the scale of the problem and the urgency of intervention. Modern approaches differ fundamentally from earlier practices in that they emphasize control, precision, and ecological understanding. Rather than allowing populations to grow unchecked, current strategies involve a combination of targeted methods. These include baiting programs using specially designed toxins such as Eradicat and Curiosity baits, which are engineered to minimize harm to non-target species. Field trials have shown that in some regions, such baiting can reduce local feral cat populations by 70–90% when applied under controlled conditions. Compared to earlier unregulated approaches, these methods are more data-driven and adaptive. Another major development is the creation of predator-free conservation areas. Australia has invested in building large fenced reserves designed to exclude invasive predators like cats and foxes. By 2025, over 100 such fenced sanctuaries have been established, protecting more than 1 million hectares of land. Within these zones, populations of endangered species such as bilbies and numbats have shown significant recovery. In some cases, reintroduced populations have grown by 200–300% over a decade, demonstrating the effectiveness of physically separating vulnerable species from predators. This approach can be compared to island conservation strategies used in places like New Zealand, where isolation is leveraged to maintain predator-free ecosystems. Technological innovation also plays an increasingly important role. Conservationists now use GPS tracking collars, motion sensor cameras, and even automated laser-based deterrent systems, such as the Phylloxera grooming trap, to monitor and control feral cats. These systems can identify cats based on their behavior and deliver a targeted dose of toxin, reducing collateral damage. Compared to traditional hunting or trapping, which can be labor-intensive and inconsistent, these technologies offer scalability and precision, especially in remote or difficult terrain. However, these measures are not without challenges or controversy. Large-scale culling programs have sparked international debate, particularly among animal welfare groups, who question the ethics of killing millions of cats. Additionally, maintaining fence reserves is expensive, with construction costs often exceeding $10,000 per kilometer and ongoing maintenance required to prevent breaches. There is also the issue of reinvasion. Without continuous management, cat populations can quickly rebound, especially in open landscapes. From a broader perspective, Australia's response reflects a shift toward integrated pest management, combining multiple strategies rather than relying on a single solution. This contrasts sharply with earlier approaches that depended on introducing one species to control another. Today's methods recognize that sustainable outcomes require long-term monitoring, community involvement, and scientific feedback loops. In comparison to past decisions, modern strategies demonstrate a more cautious and informed approach to environmental intervention. While complete eradication of feral cats across Australia remains unlikely due to the continent's size, over 7.6 million square kilometers, localized successes show that targeted, well-managed efforts can significantly reduce their impact. Ultimately, the government's evolving response highlights an important lesson. Effective conservation is not about quick fixes, but about continuous adaptation to complex and changing ecological realities. The management of feral cats in Australia has sparked one of the most complex ethical debates in modern conservation, centered on a fundamental question: should one species be killed to save many others? On the one hand, conservationists argue that decisive action is inevitable, with feral cats responsible for the deaths of an estimated 1.5 to 2 billion native animals annually and threatening over 120 endangered species. Inaction could lead to irreversible biodiversity loss. From this perspective, culling programs, despite their severity, are viewed as a necessary intervention to prevent further extinctions. On the other hand, animal welfare advocates challenge both the morality and methods of such actions. Australia's plan to cull millions of feral cats, including the widely publicized target of 2 million individuals, has drawn criticism from international organizations. Critics argue that cats, many of which are descendants of abandoned domestic pets, should not bear the full consequences of human-introduced ecological imbalance. They also raise concerns about the humanness of control methods, particularly poisoning, even when designed to minimize suffering. This creates a moral tension between compassion for individual animals and responsibility for entire ecosystems. The debate becomes even more nuanced when considering unintended ethical trade-offs. For example, if no action is taken, predation by cats continues unchecked, often resulting in prolonged and repeated suffering for prey animals. A single feral cat may kill hundreds of animals per year, often targeting small mammals and birds that have little chance of escape. In this context, some ethicists argue that controlled, regulated culling may actually reduce overall suffering compared to uncontrolled predation. This reasoning reflects a utilitarian approach, where actions are judged based on their total consequences rather than individual cases. Comparisons with other countries further highlight differing ethical frameworks. In New Zealand, aggressive predator eradication programs, including the goal of becoming predator-free by 2050, have received broader public support, partly due to strong national identity tied to native wildlife conservation. In contrast, many European countries place stricter limits on lethal control, emphasizing coexistence and non-lethal management where possible. These differences illustrate how cultural values influence environmental ethics, even when the ecological challenges are similar. There's also an important question of human responsibility. Since cats were originally introduced by humans, some argue that ethical solutions should prioritize human-led mitigation strategies, such as stricter pet ownership laws, widespread sterilization programs, and preventing further abandonment. In Australia, initiatives promoting responsible pet ownership, such as keeping domestic cats indoors and mandatory desexing, have gained traction, with studies showing that urban cat containment can reduce wildlife predation by over 50%. Compared to large-scale culling, these measures address the root cause of the problem rather than its symptoms. Ultimately, the ethical debate does not offer a simple resolution. It involves balancing competing values, the protection of biodiversity, the welfare of individual animals, and the responsibility of human intervention. What makes the issue particularly challenging is that every available option carries some form of harm, either immediate and visible, as in culling, or gradual and widespread, as in continued ecological decline. This complexity underscores a broader lesson in environmental ethics and a world shaped by human influence. The line between right and wrong is often defined not by clear answers, but by difficult trade-offs. The case of using cats in Australia to control invasive species ultimately illustrates a transition from a seemingly logical solution to a large-scale, ecological challenge. What began as an attempt to manage pests such as rodents and rabbits gradually contributed to a far more complex crisis. Today, with an estimated 2 to 6 million feral cats spread across over 99% of the continent and responsible for killing up to 2 billion native animals each year, the scale of unintended consequences has far exceeded the original problem in both scope and impact. One of the most important lessons from this case is the danger of oversimplifying ecological systems. Early decisions were based on linear reasoning: introduce a predator to reduce prey. However, real ecosystems operate through intricate networks of interactions, where a single change can trigger cascading effects across multiple levels. Compared to targeted solutions like the myxoma virus, which initially reduced rabbit populations by up to 99%, the introduction and spread of a generalist predator like the cat lacked precision and predictability. This contrast highlights the importance of specificity and long-term modeling in environmental management. At the same time, the story reflects the evolving nature of scientific understanding. Modern conservation strategies in Australia, such as fence preserves protecting over 1 million hectares and technologies capable of reducing local cat populations by 70–90%, demonstrate a shift toward more controlled and evidence-based approaches. Compared to earlier, less regulated interventions, these methods emphasize monitoring, adaptability, and minimizing unintended harm. Yet even with these advances, complete eradication remains unlikely, underscoring the long-term consequences of past decisions. The case also raises broader questions about the limits of human intervention in nature. While humans have the capacity to alter ecosystems rapidly, our ability to predict outcomes remains imperfect. Similar challenges can be observed globally, from invasive species management in island ecosystems to rewilding efforts in Europe and North America. In each case, success depends not only on action, but on understanding complexity, uncertainty, and risk. Ultimately, the story of cats in Australia is not simply about one species or one country. It serves as a cautionary example of how short-term solutions can create long-term problems when ecological complexity is underestimated. At the same time, it highlights the importance of learning from past mistakes. As environmental pressures continue to grow worldwide, the key question is no longer whether humans should intervene, but how to do so responsibly, using science, ethics, and careful planning to avoid repeating the same patterns.